Police officers attacked a black woman walking down the street with her two white children, unaware of her true identity. When the truth was revealed, they were left in shock and disbelief. Amara, a black woman in her 30s, is a respected judge at the civil court. After years of tirelessly working and fighting for the values she believes in, she understands the pressures of upholding justice. However, this Saturday morning, she set aside her usual stresses and heavy responsibilities to enjoy precious time with her two adopted sons, Liam and Ethan. The morning was clear and bright, with a deep blue sky free of clouds, and the gentle morning sun spread warmth through every corner of the neighborhood. This suburban area, known for its peaceful atmosphere, features large houses, spacious lawns, and tall trees lining both sides of the street. Amara cherished every walk along this tree-shaded path. The fresh air, mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass and the subtle aroma of wildflowers, gave her a sense of peace and calm. Liam, the older child with light brown hair and fair skin, was full of energy, darting ahead of his mother and brother. His curious, sparkling eyes absorbed everything around him, and he kept asking Amara about everything he noticed along the way. This morning, he spotted a brown squirrel leaping from branch to branch and shouted to his mother excitedly. "Mom, look, a squirrel!" he yelled, waving his hand toward the tree. Ethan, his younger brother, was quieter and more reserved, holding tightly to Amara's hand. While Ethan wasn't as expressive as Liam, Amara could feel his closeness and sense of security as he stayed close to her side. Ethan looked up at Amara with complete trust, his gentle smile warming her heart. The two children, with their light brown hair and fair skin, presented a striking contrast to Amara's deep brown skin. Although strangers sometimes looked at them with curiosity or even suspicion, Amara never paid attention. To her, Liam and Ethan were her beloved sons, her joy, and the reason she woke up every morning, fighting tirelessly for a fairer world. Amara glanced down at her sons, and a wave of happiness and pride filled her heart. As a judge, her work often placed her in the face of severe challenges and pressures from society, the courtroom, and the prejudices related to race and ethnicity. But it was these peaceful moments, walking quietly with her sons through these serene streets, that gave her the greatest strength. Amara knew that each case she championed in the courtroom was not only about justice for others, but also about creating a safer, kinder world for Liam and Ethan. As she watched her children playing, Amara found herself reflecting on the long, difficult journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced many instances of discrimination, from careless comments to strange looks, from minor incidents to intense conflicts. But Amara never gave up. She learned to stand tall, hold her ground, and set an example for her children. She always wanted to teach them about courage, compassion, and justice, the values she believed would help them grow into strong and kind individuals. Liam gleefully shouted again upon seeing a bird fly from one branch to another. Ethan looked up too, his hand still tightly gripping Amara's, his wide eyes taking in everything around him. The three of them continued their walk through the quiet streets, with large houses and lush green lawns, the tall trees rustling softly in the breeze, creating a beautiful, peaceful scene that felt worlds away from the hectic outside world. Amara took a deep breath, savoring the tranquility and peace of this weekend morning. This peaceful moment made her forget the tense court sessions, the judgmental stares, and the rumors about differences. But she had no idea that, at this very moment, an incident was about to unfold that would shatter this tranquility, forcing her to confront immense challenges to justice and honor, not just for herself, but for the two sons she cherished. As Amara continued walking with her two sons along the quiet, tree-lined road, she suddenly heard the hum of an engine in the distance. A police car was slowly approaching, its sound breaking the morning's tranquility. At first, Amara thought it was just a routine patrol in the area, and that she had no reason to worry. However, as the car drew closer, she noticed it wasn't merely passing by. It stopped right beside them, close to the curb. A sense of unease crept into her, a feeling she was all too familiar with, yet always tried to ignore. Two officers stepped out of the car. The one leading was an older officer, tall and solidly built, with a stern face and sharp eyes. He stood slightly leaning forward, his serious gaze fixed on Amara and her children as if assessing something. Behind him was a younger officer, appearing to be in his early 20s. He looked at Amara and the children with a face that showed hints of confusion and discomfort, though he was following the older officer's lead. Amara stood still, looking at the two policemen, feeling the tension slowly building around them. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, but took a deep breath to remain calm. She knew that her confidence and composed demeanor were essential at this moment, especially with Liam and Ethan by her side. Both boys watched her closely, their faces showing confusion and curiosity, not understanding what was happening. The older officer approached, his scrutinizing gaze shifting from Amara's face to the two children beside her. His eyes reflected a hint of suspicion. "Ma'am, are these your children?" he asked, his voice low and cold, with a noticeable undertone of doubt. He paused, looking at the children as if searching for something unusual. The unspoken bias in his question stirred frustration within Amara, but she restrained herself and replied calmly, "Yes, they are my children." Her response was clear, but she understood this was no casual question. It was filled with implication, laced with skepticism about a black woman having two white children. Amara was accustomed to the curious or doubtful stares of strangers when they saw her with her sons, but this was the first time she faced such a situation with police officers, those who were supposed to protect and uphold justice, not question her simply because of her skin color. The young officer behind her, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, cleared his throat as if to gather his courage, then spoke hesitantly. "Ma'am, could you show us some identification?" This question, though gentler, didn't lessen Amara's sense of annoyance and indignation. Why did she have to prove that she was the mother of her children, simply because her skin color differed from theirs? Amara looked at her two sons, Liam, wide-eyed, staring at the officers with a mix of confusion and a hint of anger, and Ethan, the younger one, standing close to her, clutching her hand tightly, his large eyes round with timidity and fear. She knew she had to do everything possible to shield them from this situation, to prevent them from fully absorbing the unfairness and prejudice that surrounded them. Yet, she also knew that remaining calm was paramount in this situation. Amara took a deep breath, then responded with a steady voice, "I don't believe I need to present identification simply for taking my children on a walk. We're just enjoying a weekend morning together, not doing anything wrong." Her tone was calm, yet firm, reflecting a woman who wouldn't easily back down. However, the older officer didn't relent. He smirked coldly and took another step closer, as if asserting his authority. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. There's been a report of suspicious activity in the area, and we need to ensure everything is under control." Hearing this, Amara immediately understood what he was implying. In their eyes, the suspicious activity was her presence, a black woman with two white children. Her heart ached from the injustice, but she didn't let her anger show. She knew that even a hint of resistance could make this situation escalate and become more dangerous. The young officer stood by silently, clearly uncomfortable, glancing at Amara and then at his colleague, seeming to sense that something wasn't right. But the older officer, with his sharp eyes and prejudiced gaze, showed no sign of backing down. "We're simply asking for your cooperation so we can finish our job," he said coldly. To him, Amara's presence with her children was suspicious, solely due to the difference in their skin colors. Amara looked into the older officer's eyes, striving to remain calm, despite the heavy feeling in her heart. She felt as if she were being judged and treated unfairly, simply for the color of her skin. Liam and Ethan stood by her side, observing the situation with confused eyes. Amara knew this was not just a confrontation between her and the officers. It was also a moment that would profoundly affect her children. A lesson on the injustice they would come to understand and face in their lives. By all means, Amara had to protect her children from feelings of fear and helplessness and show them that their mother was strong, no matter how serious the situation. At the same time, she needed to navigate this tension without compromising her dignity. Amara knew this would be a challenging encounter, and she had to be prepared for whatever might come next. Amara tried to keep calm, but deep inside, she felt anger rising in response to the suspicion and hostility in the eyes of the two police officers. She knew that even a small act of defiance could escalate the situation in a direction she didn't want. With her experience in the legal profession, Amara understood the importance of staying calm and composed, especially in circumstances where a single mistake could make everything more dangerous. Liam and Ethan stood close to her, sensing the tension but still too young to grasp the reality of the situation. Liam, a bright and perceptive child, looked up at his mother with questioning eyes, while Ethan clung tightly to Amara's hand, his large, curious eyes filled with innocence. She knew her children were not yet old enough to understand the implicit biases and injustices she was facing. She didn't want them to feel frightened or hurt, so she maintained her composure, concealing her true emotions. Amara took a deep breath, looked directly into the older officer's eyes, and spoke with calm determination. "These children are my adopted sons." She articulated each word clearly, attempting to convey sincerity and resolve in her tone, hoping this would help the officers understand that they were simply a family out for a morning walk. However, the older officer showed no sign of relenting. He stared intently at Amara, his face unyielding and devoid of empathy. "We need to make sure everything is in order," he replied coldly. His words cut deeply into Amara, as she realized that, in his eyes, the racial difference between her and her sons was enough to cast suspicion and judgment. Amara glanced at the younger officer, who looked uncomfortable, with a hesitant expression that suggested some empathy. Perhaps he too sensed the injustice of the situation, but didn't dare to challenge his superior. His silent complicity only made the situation harder for Amara. She felt a weight of frustration and helplessness pressing on her chest. She recalled countless times in her life when she'd been met with suspicious stares and sarcastic remarks simply because of her skin color. But this time, she wasn't just standing up. For herself, she was protecting her children, shielding them from the unfairness they couldn't yet fully comprehend. She looked down at Liam and Ethan, feeling a pang of sorrow as she saw her children's innocent eyes watching her every move. She didn't want them to witness their mother being treated unjustly. She knew this would become an unforgettable memory in their childhood, one she hoped to soften by demonstrating resilience and calm. "We're just taking a walk," Amara said, her voice gentle yet resolute. "There's nothing suspicious here. I hope you understand and allow us to continue with our morning." She hoped her sincere words might change the officer's attitude, but she knew in her heart that this would not be easy. Prejudices are deeply ingrained in many minds, and changing them isn't something that can happen in an instant. The older officer took a long breath, his cold gaze unyielding. "I need to see your identification," he demanded, his tone firm, more like an order than a request. His words struck Amara like a sharp pain. She realized that she couldn't simply be a mother, couldn't simply be Amara, as long as society continued to view her with suspicion. Liam, with the bright curiosity of an 8-year-old, looked directly at the older officer. He couldn't understand why they were questioning his mother so much. "My mom didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice small, but filled with determination. His words sliced through the tense atmosphere, and Amara felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. The older officer looked at Liam for a moment, then turned back to Amara, his face still filled with distrust. She knew she was in a difficult situation, and any misstep on her part could make things worse. But Amara stood firm. She had no reason to bow or appear weak in front of those who enforced justice, yet held such unfair biases. Amara looked at her children again, trying to convey a sense of peace through her gaze. "Don't worry, I'm here, and I'll protect you," she whispered to Liam and Ethan, her voice gentle but filled with resolve. For her, this was not just a confrontation with two police officers. It was also a chance to teach her children a lesson in courage, in standing strong against injustice. Even though the situation was tense and difficult, Amara knew she could not afford to falter. She had spent her life building an image of a strong woman, a loving mother, and an impartial judge. And today, in this very moment, she would not let anyone diminish her dignity, no matter the color of her skin. Amara stood there, feeling as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. She held Ethan's hand tightly, feeling his small hand trembling in hers. She knew that every decision she made now would impact not only herself, but also her children's future and their understanding of this world. She glanced at Liam, the older boy, watching the officers with a mixture of fear and resentment on his face. She understood that from this moment on, her son would forever remember the feeling of being treated unfairly. The older officer stood there as well, his cold eyes fixed on Amara, lips pressed tight, and his hand resting near the handcuffs at his hip. He seemed ready to act at any sign of resistance from her. The atmosphere was so heavy and tense that even the sound of birds singing or leaves rustling in the breeze couldn't ease the sense of unease surrounding the three of them. Amara knew that with each passing second, this situation grew worse. If she reacted, she risked being handcuffed and taken in right here, in front of her horrified children. Such a scene wouldn't just scar her, it would become a painful and haunting memory for her kids, forcing them to face injustice and discrimination they couldn't yet fully comprehend. But if she bowed her head and complied with the officer's unreasonable demand, she would sacrifice her dignity and self-respect. She had spent her life building the image of a strong woman, a fair judge, and a loving mother. She wasn't about to let anyone, even those in authority, diminish her, simply because her skin color was different. Amara took a deep breath, her eyes filled with determination. "You want to take me in? Fine. But remember, I am well aware of my rights," she said, her voice calm yet resolute, making both officers pause. The older officer's eyes flickered with surprise, though only briefly before he quickly resumed his stern and detached expression. "You don't understand the situation, ma'am," he replied, his voice cold. "We're just doing our duty to ensure the security of this area." Amara could sense the judgment in his words, and her anger rose. "Security? You see a mother walking with her two children and decide that's suspicious? Just because we're of different races," she challenged, her voice filled with defiance. The older officer smirked slightly, though he tried to mask it. "This is our jurisdiction, and we have the right to check anyone if we see fit," he replied, though there was a hint of hesitation in his tone. Perhaps he realized his reasoning wasn't entirely convincing. Amara remained steady, unfazed. She knew that, with her legal experience and understanding of her rights, she could handle this situation. She had defended the rights of many in the courtroom, and today she wouldn't let herself be subdued by this injustice. Liam looked at his mother, his young eyes shining with admiration mixed with worry. "Mom, why are they doing this?" he asked, his voice small but loud enough for the officers to hear. Liam's question cut through the tense air, adding weight to the moment. He didn't understand why his mother, who always loved and protected him, was being treated this way. To Liam, his mother was a hero, and he couldn't accept the injustice she was facing. Ethan, still clutching Amara's hand, pressed close to her side, his wide eyes full of innocence. He was too young to grasp the full extent of the situation, but he sensed the tension and fear, clinging even tighter to his mother. He looked up at her, his large eyes filled with complete trust, as though he knew he would be safe as long as she was there. The older officer glanced at Liam, then looked back at Amara, his cold gaze unchanging. "Will you show us your identification or not?" he asked, his tone now more of a command than a request, as though any hesitation from Amara would lead to serious consequences. Amara kept her composure, though inside, she felt a burning mix of anger and hurt. She had faced many challenges in life, but nothing compared to the feeling of helplessness as she watched such blatant discrimination unfold before her children's eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "I don't believe showing my identification is necessary in this situation. I have no obligation to prove anything, simply because of the difference in skin color between me and my children," she said, her tone resolute and unwavering. The older officer looked at her, his eyes challenging. He didn't like being confronted, especially by a woman he deemed less powerful than himself. He took a step closer to Amara, his hand moving closer to his handcuffs. "You can cooperate or not, but I assure you, we have the authority to handle this situation as we see fit." Amara looked back at him, unmoved. "Then go ahead," she said, defiant. She was ready for anything, but her pride and dignity would not allow her to bow before such senseless injustice. The younger officer beside him seemed to feel the extreme tension in the air. He stood silently, his eyes filled with discomfort and uncertainty. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but didn't dare to speak up against his superior. Instead, he merely stood there, bearing witness to the situation in helpless silence. Amara turned to her children, holding their hands tightly, and gently said, "I'm here. Everything will be okay." She felt the trembling in Ethan's hand and the anger in Liam's eyes, but she still smiled, a reassuring, determined smile. At that moment, she knew she was fighting not only for herself, but also for her children and for the values she had built and upheld throughout her life. Amara looked directly at the older officer, sensing the urgency and intensity of the situation reached an all-time high. She knew that if she didn't act now, things could worsen, and she would not allow herself to be subdued simply because of the prejudice of those who were supposed to uphold justice. The older officer's cold, determined eyes stayed fixed on her, his hand already in his handcuffs, ready to act. Amara knew that, regardless of her strength, being arrested in front of her children would leave them with deep emotional scars. This wasn't only a matter of her dignity, but also of protecting her children's sense of safety and their memories of their mother. She couldn't let them witness her humiliation simply due to injustice and bias. Before the officer could say anything further, Amara took a deep breath, steadying her voice to be calm yet authoritative. She stepped forward, looked him squarely in the eyes and said, "I am a judge at the civil court, specializing in cases of racial discrimination, and I am well aware of my rights." Her words rang out clearly, each one hitting the older officer's arrogance like a powerful strike. The truth she revealed left both officers momentarily stunned. The older officer took a step back, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion. The younger officer widened his eyes, anxiety and concern evident in his gaze. Amara continued, her voice growing sharper. "Are you aware that stopping and questioning someone solely because of their different skin color is an act of discrimination? I have seen countless cases like this in the courtroom, but I never imagined I would face it myself, especially in front of my children." The young officer glanced nervously at his colleague, clearly unprepared for the situation, and realizing it was quickly slipping out of control. He awkwardly looked down, avoiding Amara's gaze, but the regret in his eyes was unmistakable. The older officer, though visibly flustered, tried to maintain his authority. However, his gaze was no longer as piercing as before. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, though his voice now carried a tone of hesitation and weakness. "We're just doing our duty, ma'am. I mean, Judge," he said, attempting to sound serious, though the resolve in his tone had diminished. Amara seized the moment, her voice authoritative yet unyielding. "If this is how you carry out your duty, by judging a black mother walking with her children simply because of their skin color difference, then it's clear you know nothing about justice or fairness. This isn't protecting people, it's an abuse of authority and prejudice." The older officer was silent, his lips pressed tight. He looked uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny the truth in Amara's words. Knowing she was a judge and understood the law made it impossible for him to dismiss the situation as he usually might. His pride was bruised, yet he was fully aware he was dealing with someone who had the power and knowledge to bring this incident into the public eye. The young officer was now entirely subdued. He looked at Amara with apologetic eyes, clearly doubting the actions he and his colleague had taken. I apologize, Judge," he said softly but sincerely. "I didn't know. I didn't think—" Amara met the young officer's eyes, seeing his remorse. However, she didn't want to let him escape the consequences of his actions so easily. "Don't apologize just because I'm a judge," she replied calmly but firmly. "Apologize because what you did was wrong, regardless of who I am." The older officer awkwardly turned away, trying to hide his discomfort. He mumbled a few incoherent apologies, then glanced back at his younger colleague, as if seeking his support. However, the young officer had completely lost his initial confidence. He merely stood there, looking at the ground, unwilling to face Amara and her two children. Amara turned back to Liam and Ethan, seeing the admiration and trust in their eyes. She knew she had done the right thing, not only to protect her dignity, but to show her children that their mother would not bow down to injustice. She had demonstrated to them that, no matter the situation, resilience and truth would always prevail. The older officer, having regained some composure, nodded slightly toward Amara, as if attempting to convey respect. "You're free to go, Judge," he said, his tone now far more conciliatory. But Amara didn't let it go so easily. "I won't let this matter rest," she said firmly. "I'll be filing a report about this incident, and I will make sure actions like this don't happen again." The young officer lowered his head, his face pale at Amara's words. Meanwhile, the older officer, though silent, clearly understood the weight of his actions. His expression showed unease and concern that he struggled to conceal but couldn't deny. Amara stood tall, a sense of pride filling every fiber of her being as she held her children's hands tightly and began walking forward. The insult and discrimination she had just endured would remain etched in her mind, but she wouldn't let them tarnish her dignity. Each step was a silent statement of resilience and self-respect, as if she were breaking through an invisible wall of fear and judgment. Amara was well aware that what had happened would leave an impression on her children. They were still too young to understand the full nature of injustice, but old enough to sense the tension and notice the strange looks and tones of others. She hoped that, though this might be a bitter memory, her children would take away an invaluable lesson from her, a lesson in strength against injustice, and the courage to stand firm. As Amara walked forward with her head held high, she didn't look back. She didn't need to see the two officers standing there, surprised and perhaps fleetingly remorseful. She knew that, in that moment, she had risen above them, not only in moral standing, but in her sense of self-respect. She had refused to let that offense shake her or lose the dignity she cherished. Instead, she responded with resilience and firmness, as a woman who would not accept injustice, no matter from whom it came. Inside, Amara felt a complex mix of emotions, a lingering pain, tempered with pride and determination. As a mother, she saw the heavy responsibility she bore, not just to protect her children from harm, but to lead by example and to be someone they could look up to. The courage she had shown was not only for herself, but also to teach her children that while the world may be filled with challenges, everyone deserves respect and has the right to stand up for fairness and justice. Feeling the small hands of her children in her own, Amara felt a warm wave of energy flow through her. It was the trust and unconditional love from her kids, a source of strength in her most trying moments. She promised herself that she would continue to fight and remain strong, not only for herself, but for her children, so they could grow up in a fairer society where no one would have to endure prejudice because of their skin color or background. Amara's steps grew stronger and more confident with each stride she left behind. Each step was an affirmation of her resolve, a woman, a mother, and above all, a person worthy of respect. After walking a short distance, Amara stopped, standing still for a few seconds, feeling as if a massive weight had just been lifted from her chest. Her heartbeat was beginning to slow, but the frustration and hurt from what she had just endured still lingered. Once she saw the police car disappear at the end of the road, she turned back to look at her two children. Liam and Ethan remained close by her side, their eyes following the shadows of trees cast under the sunlight. Liam, the older child, now looked at his mother with deep admiration and respect. He had witnessed her standing up to those in power, refusing to be subdued by discrimination, and it had instilled in him a newfound sense of justice and resilience. Ethan, the younger one, still clung to his mother's hand, his innocent eyes unable to fully grasp the significance of what had happened, but sensing some of the injustice his family had faced. Amara knelt down and gently hugged both children, feeling their warmth and the peace she had worked so hard to protect for them. She whispered, "Everything is okay now. I'm always here with you. We won't let anything break our family." She stroked Liam and Ethan's hair, hoping her warm embrace and gentle words would ease some of the anxiety and worry they were feeling. Liam looked up, his eyes shining with pride. "Mom, you weren't afraid. You were so strong," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Amara smiled gently, nodding and replying, "Yes, Liam. And I want you to remember, there is nothing wrong with standing up for yourself, especially when faced with injustice. Justice isn't something that's handed to us. Sometimes we have to fight for it." Ethan listened quietly, his eyes showing a mix of worry and admiration. "But Mom, I was still scared when they came near you. I didn't want you to be taken away," he said, his innocent voice carrying sincere worry. Amara bent down, looking into Ethan's clear eyes, and said, "I understand, Ethan. Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, and it makes them act wrongly. But I'll always be here to protect you, and we will never be afraid when we know we're in the right." She straightened up, looking down the sunlit road, her mindset with clarity. She wouldn't let this incident be forgotten. She had seen too many similar cases in the courtroom, cases where people had to endure unfair treatment due to prejudice or discrimination. This time, she would personally ensure that those who had wronged her and her children would be held accountable. When the three of them returned home, Amara could feel a solemn atmosphere settle over them. She gently closed the door, noticing the lingering worry in her children's eyes, and felt a deep sadness within herself. Despite facing everything with strength and resilience, Amara couldn't deny that today's discrimination had left a lasting mark on her soul, and, more importantly, in the minds of her two children. She led Liam and Ethan into the living room, sat down on the sofa, pulled them close, and held them tightly, as though shielding them from the world's injustices. Liam, her intelligent and sensitive boy, looked at her with a questioning gaze. He couldn't understand why his mother, whom he always saw as a hero, had to face such doubt and scorn merely because of her skin color. Ethan, although younger and not fully able to grasp the significance of what had happened, also looked confused and unsettled, his innocent eyes reflecting the worry he felt. Amara sat there with her children in her arms, her gaze distant and her heart heavy. She knew that what had happened today was not just a momentary painful experience, but a lesson etched into Liam and Ethan's minds about how the world could treat them. She didn't want them to go through this, but life had thrust them into a challenging situation. She wondered if she could teach her children to overcome injustice and keep compassion and faith in goodness, even though she felt wounded. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her thoughts and chose her words carefully, aiming to convey to her children the complexities of life, that no matter how harsh the world might be, they could still keep their hearts pure. Amara looked down at Liam and Ethan, who watched her expectantly with their wide eyes. To her, they were her greatest motivation, the reason she was determined never to bow to injustice. "Liam, Ethan," Amara began, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I know that what happened today is confusing and upsetting. Sometimes, people make wrong judgments simply because they don't understand differences. Skin color, appearance, or someone's background don't define who they are, but not everyone sees that." Liam looked up, his gaze a mix of curiosity and pain. "Mom, why would they think bad things about you? You didn't do anything wrong," he asked, his voice trembling as he struggled to understand human complexity. Amara looked into her son's clear eyes, feeling a pang in her heart. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people judge others based on what they see, especially if they don't understand, or if they're afraid. It's a flaw in their hearts, a prejudice that's hard to change. They saw my skin color is different from yours, and they assumed something was wrong without even thinking about why." Ethan looked up at her too, his face full of confusion and worry. "But you're our mom. You're not a bad person," he said quietly, his small hand gripping hers tightly, as though seeking comfort and affirmation. Amara gently squeezed Ethan's hand, her gaze tender and full of love. "I know, Ethan, and you must always remember that nothing can change that truth. You are my children, and we are a family. That doesn't change, no matter what others might think or say." She continued, her voice growing firmer, as if to instill her resolve in them. "The most important thing I want you to understand today is that no matter how much unfairness we face, we mustn't let it make our hearts cold or full of hate. As you grow up, you'll meet many people, some who will treat you well, and others who won't understand or accept differences. But what's important is that you keep kindness and goodness in your hearts." Liam tilted his head, his eyes lighting up with a new determination. "I understand, Mom. I won't let anyone hurt me or make me a bad person. I'll keep my heart kind, just like you taught me," he said, his young voice filled with enthusiasm, but also a glimpse of profound understanding. Amara smiled, pride swelling in her heart. She knew that, despite the painful experience of today, it had also been an opportunity to instill in her children the most cherished values she had held on to throughout her life. She gently brushed Ethan's hair, feeling warmth as he whispered, "I'll keep my heart kind too, Mom." Amara nodded softly, hugging them both close. "I'm so proud of you, Liam and Ethan. You were both very brave today, and I want you to know that on this journey, I will always be by your side. No matter what happens, I'll be here to protect you and teach you to face the world with resilience and kindness." Amara knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that her family would face further prejudice and judgmental looks, but she believed that by preparing her children with core values and steadfastness, they would be able to protect themselves in any situation. More importantly, they would learn to face the world not with fear, but with courage and faith in what is good. After comforting her children, Amara led them to the kitchen, where she prepared a light snack of cookies and milk, a way to soothe their spirits and bring them a sense of security. As the three of them sat around the table, chatting and laughing together, Amara realized that her children's smiles and laughter were her greatest strength. She knew that she would continue to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for them, so they could grow up in a world with less prejudice and injustice. She also resolved that today's events would not be forgotten. Once the children were tucked into bed, Amara sat in her study, adding the final lines to her complaint report. She knew this was only the beginning, and she was prepared to face any challenge to defend the values she believed in. Sending off the complaint, she felt an unusual sense of peace. It wasn't just the relief of having done the right thing, but the belief that she had done everything to ensure justice for herself and her children. Finally, before heading to bed, Amara paused at Liam and Ethan's door, looking at her two children as they slept peacefully. She smiled, her heart full of pride and gratitude for having them in her life. She silently promised to keep fighting for a brighter future, a future where her children and all children wouldn't have to face discrimination and injustice. In the comforting darkness of the night, Amara felt a powerful sense of hope. Though the journey ahead was long and difficult, she knew she was not alone, because with her, she had the love of her children and the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow. 8. Soon after Amara filed an official complaint regarding the actions of the two police officers, an internal investigation was launched. Not long after, word of the incident spread within the force, becoming a hot topic of discussion. For the two officers, especially the older one, a sense of worry began to settle. They knew their behavior was under scrutiny, and this was not a situation they could easily escape. The younger officer, who had already felt remorse during the confrontation, was increasingly haunted by the incident. He couldn't forget Amara's unflinching, fearless gaze as she declared herself a judge, and, more importantly, he felt a pang of guilt when he thought of the innocent children who had to witness their mother being treated unjustly. Throughout the investigation, he questioned whether he truly belonged in the police force, or if he had perhaps chosen the wrong career path. Meanwhile, the older officer felt a mixture of anger and anxiety. He was not used to being questioned or having his actions scrutinized. Over years of work, he had developed a rigid mindset, believing he had the right to make any judgment solely based on intuition and experience. However, the incident with Amara forced him to confront the reality that his actions could have serious consequences, not only for others, but for his career. After weeks of investigation and review, Amara's complaint was substantiated, and the Internal Oversight Department decided to impose disciplinary measures on both officers. The older officer was suspended for a long period, with a clear warning that any future misconduct could result in dismissal. He tried to keep his composure, but it was obvious that the event had left a profound mark on him. Gone was his previous smugness. He now understood that he couldn't act impulsively without facing repercussions. The younger officer received a lighter punishment, but he felt a deep pain from the realization that he hadn't been brave enough to speak out against wrongdoing. During his suspension, he began to reflect on his career path, the reasons he had joined the police force, and the values he had once believed in. He realized he had allowed fear and pressure from colleagues to affect his decisions, leading him to remain silent when he should have stood up for justice and rights. One quiet afternoon, after receiving his disciplinary decision, the young officer sat alone, staring into the distance as if trying to rediscover himself amidst recent events. The scenes of the past few weeks played vividly in his mind like a haunting film. Regret filled him as he remembered Amara's disappointed, cold gaze, the look of a woman he had treated unfairly. Every glance, every thoughtless action had left scars on others, and now he felt he bore invisible wounds himself. The image of the two innocent children clinging to their mother in fear remained clear in his mind, twisting his heart. Their eyes were filled with confusion and fear, silently asking, "Why do we have to endure this?" This unspoken question felt like a sharp blade, piercing the young officer's conscience. He began to ask himself, "Is this truly the path I want to take? Do my actions help the community, or do they only breed fear and tension?" He realized that if he continued to act in the same way, he would only be a part of a prejudiced system, where innocent people were subjected to injustice. At that moment, he deeply felt the need to change, not just for his conscience, but for his faith in justice and his responsibility as someone who was meant to protect it. He knew that if he didn't change, there would be many more people like Amara and her children who would suffer the consequences of his mistakes and those of his colleagues. This determination pushed the young officer to take action. He decided to enroll in a training program to learn how to handle situations without letting bias cloud his judgment. He wanted to equip himself not only with better handling skills, but with an understanding heart, a heart that would protect others without discrimination of race, religion, or social status. He realized that being a police officer was not just about enforcing the law, but about safeguarding safety and fairness for everyone. The training process was not easy. He had to confront long-held prejudices, reassess himself, and accept that he had been wrong. During these months, he gradually understood that justice wasn't only about arrests or punishment, but also about compassion, listening, and fair treatment. Each lesson and each practical exercise helped him recognize that he needed to change, not just to become a better officer, but to become a better person. He promised himself that from now on, in any situation, he would try to put himself in others' shoes, to understand their fears and concerns. He would no longer let anger or prejudice dictate his actions. Instead, he would act with empathy. Each small step on this journey of change brought him a sense of relief, as though a heavy burden was being lifted from his heart. For him, this new journey was a chance to rectify past mistakes and help rebuild trust in the community. He hoped that one day he could meet Amara and her children again, not as someone who had caused them pain, but as a true protector, someone they could trust. While the young officer embarked on a path of self-transformation, the older officer was mired in internal conflicts and pressure from his work environment. Each day, facing the doubtful eyes and criticisms of colleagues, he felt the weight of his reputation under threat, and his once secure career now seemed on the brink. As someone who had dedicated many years, he took pride in his role, believing that strictness and principles were essential to maintaining order and discipline. Yet, in the eyes of the younger officers, he could see a clear difference in perspectives and approaches. They emphasized fairness, respect, and empathy, values he once saw as secondary in his career. For him, power and experience were the true measures of success. But as these old beliefs became increasingly outdated, he began to wonder if his convictions were still relevant. Over time, the older officer began to realize that authority and experience were no longer enough to earn the trust and respect of his colleagues, especially younger ones who represented progress and change. Doubts from colleagues and questions from within himself made him feel unsteady and no longer as confident as before. He questioned whether, in the past, he had been too harsh with those who made mistakes, too rigid in his views, without considering what others might be going through. At night, sitting alone in his office, he recalled past incidents, moments he had once believed to be justified, but now revealed the flaws of his rigid approach. Some young colleagues had left the force, unable to endure his harsh criticism. Those memories haunted him, regret washing over him like waves. This made him think of the young officer, a complete contrast to himself. That young man had made mistakes and faced difficulties, but was willing to confront them, to change and grow. This transformation not only helped the young officer mature, but also earned him the respect of his peers. Looking at that example, The older officer began to wonder, perhaps it's time for me to reconsider everything, to start changing myself. This inner reflection opened a new perspective for him, one he had never considered before. He realized that true strength lay not only in power or authority, but also in the ability to understand and respect others' dignity. This was a journey of self-change, acknowledging his mistakes and letting go of old prejudices. For him, this was a significant challenge, but deep down, he knew it was necessary to regain the trust of those around him and to take pride in himself. Perhaps this journey of change would not be easy and would not happen quickly. But with each small step, with every time he set aside his ego, he would gradually find peace within. This was an opportunity for him to become a true leader, not merely someone who commanded, but someone who could inspire and bring trust to others. And perhaps it would be a way to make up for the harm he had caused in the past. The path to change, though slow, would be a meaningful step to prove that it is never too late to become a better person. As for Amara, she knew this was only the beginning of her journey to reclaim justice and ensure that discriminatory actions like these would not go unchallenged. She received news of the police department's disciplinary decision regarding the two officers, and while she felt satisfied, she understood this was not the end. For her, this incident was a reminder of the challenges her community faced, and she would continue to fight, not only for herself, but for everyone enduring injustice. Amara continued her work in court, and every time she saw someone facing unfair treatment, she remembered her own experience and felt a deeper empathy for them. She promised herself she would never stop fighting to change the system, little by little, to make sure others would not have to go through what she and her children had experienced. In the following weeks, the young officer approached Amara, offering a sincere apology and sharing his decision to change. He said that the incident had opened a new door for him, helping him recognize past mistakes and inspiring him to become a truly fair and just police officer. Amara looked into his eyes and saw genuine remorse. She smiled, gently placing a hand on his shoulder and said, "What matters is not the past, but what we learn from it to change the future." In the end, Amara's experience sparked a wave of change, not only within the police force, but also within herself. She knew there were many others like her, ready to stand up for justice and dignity. From this incident, she felt the power of perseverance and courage, along with the belief that, no matter how difficult the journey, justice would ultimately prevail. In the days that followed, Amara felt her resolve growing stronger. She realized that her confrontation with the two police officers was merely the tip of the iceberg within a system riddled with prejudice and injustice. This was not the first time she had witnessed discrimination, but it was the first time she found herself in the midst of it, facing the cold eyes of those who were supposed to uphold justice. Amara understood that to protect the values she believed in, she couldn't stop at a complaint. She had to go further, determined not only to change one incident, but to change the entire system. With this in mind, Amara began delving deeper into police force policies, human rights laws, and complaint handling processes. She attended workshops, discussed issues with legal experts and human rights organizations, and sought to understand the complexities of systemic reform. Soon, Amara realized she couldn't change everything alone, but if she could build a network of like-minded individuals, change would become achievable. Amara not only reached out to lawmakers, but also began meeting with other families who had experienced similar situations. She wanted to create a community where people could share their stories, support each other, and collectively push for systemic reform. In these gatherings, she witnessed a deep sense of empathy and solidarity. People no longer felt alone in this fight, and thanks to Amara, they found the strength to stand up for their rights. Each time she returned home after these community meetings, Amara spent time talking with her two children, Liam and Ethan. She knew they were still young, and couldn't fully understand everything she was doing. But she wanted to instill in them the values of fairness, kindness, and resilience. Sitting beside them, she shared stories of the people she had met, explaining that no matter how challenging things might be, one person could make a difference. She said, "Liam, Ethan, I want you to remember that there is nothing wrong with standing up for what's right. No matter how complicated the world is, we can always do good." Her words planted a strong sense of belief in her children. Liam, the older one, began to understand the meaning of his mother's fight. He looked at her with admiration and pride, and from that moment on, whenever he encountered difficulties, he thought of what his mother had taught him. Meanwhile, Ethan, though younger, remembered his mother's words, and a budding sense of justice started forming in his young heart, a sense of standing up for truth and right. At a civil rights conference, Amara was invited to speak, to share her story and the effort she was undertaking. In front of hundreds of attendees, Amara recounted the moment she and her children were stopped by the police and how she decided to stand up for justice. She didn't just speak about her pain, but emphasized that this fight was a shared struggle for values that anyone could see themselves in. As she recalled, Amara couldn't hide her emotions, remembering her children's confused eyes and the surge of indignation she felt at that moment. She shared with the audience her sense of helplessness when explaining society's injustices to her children and her determination to ensure that such things wouldn't happen to others. "We live in a society burdened with prejudice," Amara said, her voice filled with emotion and conviction. "But that doesn't mean we have to accept it. Each of us here has the power to make a difference, no matter how small. When we stand together, that power becomes extraordinary. I believe that if we persist, if we continue fighting, one day we will create a fair society where no one has to endure discrimination simply for being different." Her words resonated strongly, stirring a deep sense of personal responsibility in everyone. Her encouragement went beyond just reflecting on injustice. It was a call to action, inviting everyone to join this journey. She shared that change is not something that comes easily. It requires everyone's resilience and courage. Amara encouraged each person to ask themselves what they could do, however small, to help create a more just world. After Amara's speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. The applause was not just recognition, but also a quiet promise that people would continue alongside her on this path. She looked out, seeing faces shining with faith and hope, feeling that her message had resonated as she intended. Many came to meet her after the conference, sharing their own stories and expressing their support for the journey she was on. Some people cried as they listened to Amara's story, feeling her pain and resilience in every word. Several admitted they had once been afraid or felt powerless in the face of injustice, but Amara's story had ignited a spark of hope within them. Amara knew that each time she shared her story, she wasn't only rekindling faith in the possibility of change, but creating a wave of unity and determination among strangers. Deep in her heart, she held a firm belief that if everyone stood together and took action, the world would one day become fairer and more compassionate. In the months that followed, Amara continued her work tirelessly. She collaborated with human rights organizations, helping to build educational programs for police officers to change how they view those they serve. She also helped draft new policies, encouraging law enforcement to adhere to principles of fairness and respect for human rights. She knew this path would not be easy, and that there would be many challenges ahead, but she never stopped hoping for a better future. One evening, after a long day's work, Amara sat by the window, gazing outside, her heart filled with contemplation. She thought of everything she had been through and the relentless effort she had invested. In those quiet moments, she understood that this fight was not just about herself, but about future generations, about everyone who would come after her and inherit a fairer society, a world unbound by irrational prejudices. Liam entered the room, noticing his mother deep in thought, and softly asked, "Mom, are you tired?" Amara smiled, pulling him into a hug. "Sometimes I feel tired, but thinking of you both gives me strength. I want to create a better world, not only for myself, but for you, so you can grow up without facing the injustices I did." Liam nodded, his eyes shining. "I'll stand with you, Mom. I'll stand up for what's right too," he said, his voice full of determination and courage. Amara held his hand tightly, feeling pride and hope swell within her. Amara knew well that the road ahead would never be easy. Confronting discrimination and prejudice along this journey, she understood that only perseverance and determination could lead her to her goal. This journey wasn't just for herself, but for her family, for her children's future, and for a generation yearning for change. She knew that giving up would not only mean losing faith in herself, but also shattering the hope of those waiting for justice. Each step Amara took was fueled by the boundless love of her family. Her children were the inspiration driving her forward. She wanted them to grow up in a world where they wouldn't fear injustice, a world they could proudly call home. For Amara, this struggle was not simply about challenging an individual or a particular system. It was a battle for profound human values. Every time she faced difficulty, she reminded herself that her sacrifices today could lay the foundation for a better society tomorrow. Her determination was like an unyielding flame, burning brightly to light the path she was on. She believed that one day, the light of justice and compassion would spread everywhere. Amara was not alone on this journey. Behind her stood a community, friends, allies, and even strangers who shared her vision. They all longed for change. This unity was something she deeply cherished. Together, they rose to defend what was right, resolute in their common goal of building a just society. Every story she heard, every tear and smile she witnessed, was a powerful motivation that helped her overcome all obstacles. In Amara's heart, there was no place for fear or discouragement. She believed that justice would ultimately prevail. This fight wasn't about revenge, but about affirming human rights and dignity. The price paid today would lay the groundwork for a brighter future for the next generations. With steadfast determination, Amara would not stop moving forward. She believed that only when we stand together and never give up can we change this world. She knew well that this struggle was not a short journey, but a long road full of challenges. Yet she was ready to face any hardship, knowing that, in the end, her efforts would not be in vain. Amara would fight until she achieved a world she could proudly pass on to her children, a place where everyone was treated fairly, and compassion was always a core value. She would see this battle through to the end, for behind her stood a generation sharing her desire, ready to build a fairer and better society. This unfortunate incident reminds us of the biases that still exist in society. The question remains, are our actions and attitudes unintentionally creating barriers and harm for others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video if you found it meaningful, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss upcoming stories. See you next time.
It was a quiet evening in suburban Virginia, and Director Marcus Holloway of the CIA was driving back from a classified briefing at Langley. The air was crisp, the streets were dimly lit, and the hum of his sleek black sedan blended with the distant sounds of nocturnal wildlife. Marcus, a man of extraordinary poise and intellect, had always felt that his unassuming demeanor helped him blend in, a trait that served him well in a career that thrived on discretion. The road ahead stretched dark and desolate. Marcus glanced at the dashboard clock, 11:23 p.m. As he approached a stop sign, a pair of glaring headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser. He paid it no mind and signaled to turn left. As soon as he made the turn, the unmistakable whirl of sirens and flashing red and blue lights shattered the night's tranquility. Marcus's brow furrowed. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any laws. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road, his calm demeanor hiding the frustration brewing beneath the surface. He rolled down his window and placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained from years of knowing the precarious balance between compliance and self-preservation. A burly white officer approached the car with a flashlight. The beam scanned the interior, lingering on Marcus's face. Without greeting or explanation, the officer barked, "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting the officer's steely gaze. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice measured and devoid of fear. "I said, step out of the car, now," the officer repeated, his hand hovering near his holster. Marcus slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, the cold night air brushing against his tailored suit. His 6-foot frame stood tall and commanding, yet he made no sudden movements. "Hands on the hood," the officer shouted. Marcus complied, his mind calculating. This wasn't about a traffic violation. The officer hadn't even asked for his license or registration. It was about something deeper, something uglier. The officer drew his weapon and aimed it squarely at Marcus's back. "What's a guy like you doing in a car like this, dressed like that?" he sneered. Marcus didn't flinch. His instincts screamed at him to de-escalate, but his training told him to stay composed. "I wasn't aware that dressing professionally was a crime," he replied, his tone razor sharp. "Are you going to tell me why you pulled me over?" The officer smirked. "We'll see about that. Let's take a look in your trunk." Marcus arched a brow. "You're not even going to ask for my ID. I said open the trunk." The officer snapped, ignoring the question. Marcus's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Very well," he said, moving to the trunk with deliberate slowness. As he opened it, the officer leaned in with his flashlight, eager to find something incriminating. What he saw made his face pale. The interior was meticulously organized, a black briefcase with an embossed seal, an official government badge perched on top, and a dossier stamped with "Top Secret." The weight of realization dawned on the officer as his flashlight flickered across the unmistakable emblem of the Central Intelligence Agency. "What's wrong, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice cool and laced with quiet authority. "Find something you weren't expecting." The officer stumbled back a step, the barrel of his gun trembling slightly as his flashlight beam remained fixed on the contents of the trunk. His jaw tightened, but his pride and prejudice outweighed the clear evidence in front of him. He wasn't about to let this man, this black man, intimidate him, regardless of the insignia staring back at him. "Step away from the trunk," he barked, his voice shaking slightly now. "You expect me to believe you're CIA, that's a good one. What are you, some kind of con man?" Marcus's expression didn't falter, though he could feel the tension. Escalating like a ticking time bomb, he calmly shut the trunk, the quiet click echoing unnervingly in the empty street. Turning to face the officer, his sharp brown eyes locked onto the man's pale blue ones. "Con man," Marcus repeated, his tone laced with quiet incredulity. "Do you often accuse people of espionage without cause, or is this your idea of enforcing the law?" The officer bristled, taking a step forward, his hand still on the gun's grip. "You don't get to question me," he snarled, "and I don't need a reason to detain you. You look suspicious." Suspicious? Marcus's voice was a mirror of calm, though his words were cutting. "Driving through my own neighborhood in a suit and tie makes me suspicious, or does my skin color give you license to ignore protocol?" The officer's face hardened. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone so composed. "Watch your mouth," he growled, though the threat sounded hollow. Marcus took a single step closer, his presence commanding. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "You're in over your head, officer. What's your name?" He glanced at the badge clipped to the man's uniform. "Stevens, Officer Stevens." The man's cheeks reddened, his grip tightening on his gun. "I don't need to explain myself to you." Marcus raised a single brow. "Actually, you do. You've failed to identify any probable cause for this stop. You've escalated to pointing a weapon without provocation, and you've ignored every standard procedure in the book. I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Stevens took another step back, feeling the weight of the situation, though his pride refused to let him back down entirely. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you? Flashing some fake badge, spouting legal nonsense." "Fake badge," Marcus interrupted, his tone as sharp as a blade. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his credentials. He held them up, the gold lettering glinting under the streetlights. "This isn't fake." My name is Marcus Halloway, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I suggest you take a good, long look at that, Officer Stevens, and think about the implications of your actions tonight." Stevens froze. His eyes darted to the badge, the seal, the photo ID. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. "I'd like you to call your supervisor," Marcus continued, his voice firm but eerily calm. "Right now." Stevens's hand wavered over his radio. I don't need to." "Oh, but you do," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure your department gets a phone call they won't forget. And trust me, Stevens, you don't want to find out what happens when the CA starts asking questions." Stevens hesitated, his mind racing. His instinct was to double down, but the cold certainty in Marcus's eyes told him he was treading on thin ice. With shaking fingers, he reached for his radio and reluctantly called in for backup. Marcus folded his arms and leaned casually against the hood of his car, watching the officer squirm. Inside, his adrenaline was spiking, but his years of training had taught him to channel it into focus. He didn't need to raise his voice or lash out. His presence alone was enough to turn the tables. As the distant wail of another patrol car approached, Stevens looked like a cornered animal, his confidence unraveling. Marcus, on the other hand, stood tall and steady, the calm in the storm. The faint whine of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense silence. Marcus remained unmoving, his arms folded as Officer Stevens shifted uncomfortably beside his squad car. The man's earlier bravado seemed to shrink with every passing second, though his hand lingered near his holstered gun, a last shred of control he clung to desperately. Marcus, however, didn't spare him a second glance. His focus was on the approaching patrol car. The second squad car pulled up to the scene, its flashing lights illuminating the quiet street in harsh, rotating hues of red and blue. Two officers stepped out, one a younger man with sandy hair and a nervous expression, the other a seasoned sergeant whose presence immediately commanded respect. Sergeant Lewis was a black man in his late 50s, his graying beard framing a face that spoke of decades of experience and little patience for nonsense. "What's going on here, Stevens?" Sergeant Lewis asked, his voice even but firm as he approached. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, lingering on Marcus, who stood with an air of calm authority. Stevens snapped to attention, though his tension was palpable. "Sir, I pulled this man over for suspicious behavior. He's claiming to be CAA, but—" Marcus cut him off, his voice measured but unyielding. "Not claiming, Sergeant. I am the director of the CIA, Marcus Halloway." He stepped forward and extended his credentials, the polished badge and identification glinting under the flashing lights. Sergeant Lewis took the badge, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. His expression remained unreadable as he turned to Marcus. "Director Halloway," he said carefully, handing back the badge, "I'm going to have to apologize on behalf of my department if there's been any misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Sergeant," Marcus replied, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "Your officer pulled me over without cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and held me at gunpoint while refusing to explain himself." Lewis's eyes flicked to Stevens, who looked like he wanted to melt into the asphalt. The sergeant's voice grew cold. "Is this true, Stevens?" Stevens stammered, his earlier confidence now entirely eroded. I thought he was. He looked suspicious, sir." "Driving an expensive car late at night." "Suspicious," Marcus interjected, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of restrained fury. "I suppose being black in a suit and tie, driving a government-issued vehicle, is all it takes to raise suspicion in your eyes." Sergeant Lewis's jaw tightened, his gaze snapping back to Stevens. "Did you even ask for his identification before drawing your weapon?" "No, sir," Stevens muttered, his face flushing red. "And why exactly did you feel the need to escalate this to a drawn weapon?" Lewis pressed, his tone growing sharper. Stevens floundered. He wasn't complying fast enough, and I—" Marcus let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't give me a chance to comply, Officer Stevens. You were too busy assuming I was a criminal." Lewis held up a hand, silencing Stevens's incoherent defense. Turning to Marcus, he inclined his head. "Director Halloway, I assure you, this will be dealt with swiftly. If you'd like, we can file a formal report right now." Marcus's expression softened, but only slightly. "I think that's a good start, Sergeant, but I'd like to stay and ensure it's handled properly. I've seen far too many cases of these incidents being swept under the rug." Lewis nodded, his respect for Marcus evident. "Understood, sir." As Sergeant Lewis called in additional units and began the process of documenting the incident, Marcus took a step closer to Stevens, his towering presence making the officer shrink even further. "You made a grave mistake tonight, Officer Stevens," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "And the consequences of your actions will be a lesson you won't soon forget." Stevens couldn't meet his gaze, his earlier arrogance now completely replaced by shame and fear. Marcus's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The street now buzzed with activity as 2 more squad cars arrived, their flashing lights casting sharp, jagged shadows on the pavement. Uniformed officers stepped out, some exchanging puzzled glances as they assessed the scene. Word had spread quickly over the radio, an incident involving a CA official. The gravity of the situation was palpable. Marcus remained composed, his arms crossed as he stood by the hood of his car. The cold air bit at his skin, but his gaze never wavered. Every movement, every word from the officers now arriving, was being etched into his memory. This wasn't just about him. This was about accountability, about ensuring this incident wouldn't disappear under bureaucratic red tape. Sergeant Lewis directed the newly arrived officers with swift efficiency. "Start taking statements," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "I want everything logged, dashcam footage, bodycam footage, timestamps. I don't care if this takes all night, we're doing this by the book." As officers moved to follow his orders, Lewis turned back to Stevens, whose face was now a mix of humiliation and dread. "Hand over your weapon," the sergeant demanded. Stevens's head snapped up, his lips parting as if to protest, but one look at Lewis's unyielding expression silenced him. Reluctantly, he unholstered his gun and handed it over, his hands shaking slightly. "Badge 2, Lewis added, holding out his other hand. "But sir, Stevens began, his voice faltering. "Badge, now," Lewis said, his tone brooking no argument. "You've crossed every line tonight, Stevens, and until this investigation is complete, you're suspended. Consider yourself lucky we're not cuffing you on the spot." Stevens hesitated, his jaw tightening as though clinging to some shred of defiance, but eventually he unclipped his badge and slapped it into Lewis's palm. His movements were jerky, his anger bubbling beneath the surface, though it was clear he had no ground to stand on. Meanwhile, Marcus stood silently, observing every detail with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading people. He watched as officers reviewed Stevens's bodycam footage, their expressions shifting from neutral professionalism to barely concealed disgust. It was clear the footage corroborated everything Marcus had said, and more. One officer, a young woman with a steady demeanor, approached Sergeant Lewis. "Sir, the footage shows Officer Stevens escalating the situation from the start. No request for ID, no explanation for the stop. He drew his weapon before Mr. Holloway even stepped out of the car." Lewis's expression darkened. "Copy the footage. Secure it as evidence. Make sure it doesn't go missing." "Yes, sir," she replied, moving to carry out the order. Stevens, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, seemed to sense the noose tightening around him. "This is a setup," he blurted, his voice rising. "He's using his position to twist this whole thing around. I thought he might be armed." The excuse hung in the air, hollow and desperate. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Armed? You didn't even give me a chance to reach for my wallet, let alone anything else. This wasn't about a weapon, Stevens. This was about me. You saw a black man driving a car you didn't think he deserved, and you acted on your prejudice." Stevens's face reddened, but he had no retort. The weight of his actions was now undeniable, laid bare in front of his colleagues. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus turned to Sergeant Lewis. "What happens next, Sergeant?" Lewis straightened, his voice steady but resolute. "Next, we file a full report. Stevens will be formally investigated for misconduct, likely stripped of his badge permanently. This isn't going away." "And what about accountability beyond your department?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but insistent. What safeguards are in place to ensure this doesn't happen again, to someone else who doesn't have the title or resources I do? Lewis hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll ensure this incident reaches the right channels. You have my word. Marcus gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, though his face remained unreadable. I'll be following up personally, he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise. As Lewis began delegating further tasks to his officers, Stevens stood frozen, his career unraveling before his eyes. For the first time that night, Marcus allowed himself a faint, grim smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. This was justice, or at least the beginning of it. Inside the small, fluorescent, lit precinct, the air was thick with tension. Marcus sat at the head of the table in the conference room, his back straight, his presence commanding without effort. Opposite him sat Sergeant Lewis, an internal affairs officer hastily summoned to oversee the incident, and Officer Stevens, whose pale, sweat-beaded face told the story of a man teetering on the edge of ruin. On the table between them lay the evidence, Stevens's bodycam footage, the official report being drafted, and Marcus's impeccable credentials. The details were stacking up against Stevens faster than he could process them. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his eyes darting to the clock, as though hoping time might somehow reverse itself. Marcus, however, remained calm and collected, though his sharp gaze betrayed the controlled fire within him. This was not his first encounter with systemic prejudice, nor was it likely to be his last. But he knew this moment was bigger than him. It was an opportunity to make sure Stevens, and others like him, were held accountable in ways they rarely were. The internal affairs officer, a stern-faced woman named Inspector Callahan, broke the silence first. "Let's go through this step by step, Officer Stevens," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "You stated you pulled Director Holloway over because he appeared suspicious. Can you clarify what about his behavior or vehicle was suspicious?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was late at night, he muttered, avoiding eye contact, and he was driving a high-end car in a neighborhood where we've had reports of car thefts. Callahan arched an unimpressed brow. So his only crime was driving an expensive car. Stevens floundered. "No, I mean he wasn't cooperating." Marcus finally spoke, his voice measured but cutting. "You didn't give me a chance to cooperate, Officer Stevens. You demanded I step out of the vehicle without stating your reason for the stop. And when I complied, you escalated to drawing your weapon." Stevens's face turned red, but Marcus pressed on, his tone unwavering. "You never asked for my ID, registration, or proof of ownership. You ignored every protocol designed to ensure mutual safety. And when I opened my trunk, you saw the truth staring you in the face, but your prejudice wouldn't let you back down. Instead, you doubled down." Callahan nodded, her pen scratching against her notepad as she recorded every word. "The bodycam footage corroborates Director Holloway's account," she said, turning to Stevens. "You escalated the situation without cause. Your actions were reckless, unprofessional, and, frankly, dangerous." Stevens opened his mouth to protest, but was silenced by Marcus's sharp gaze. "Let me ask you something, Officer Stevens," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "If I weren't wearing this suit, if I didn't have that CA badge, how do you think this night would have ended?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Stevens looked away, his jaw tightening, but he couldn't answer. The truth was painfully clear. Sergeant Lewis, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice low and steady. "Director Holloway, I think we all know the answer to that question, and it's a question we've all had to face too many times." Marcus turned to Lewis, his expression softening slightly. "Then let's not treat this as just another internal incident swept under the rug. You have an opportunity here to make a statement, not just to Officer Stevens, but to your entire department." Callahan nodded in agreement. "Director Holloway is right. This isn't an isolated event, and we all know it. Officer Stevens's actions tonight were a symptom of a larger problem. If we don't address it head-on, we're complicit." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Stevens slumped further into his chair, realizing that any defense he might muster would crumble under the mountain of evidence and the glaring reality of his actions. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but resolute. "I don't want a slap on the wrist or a temporary suspension. I want accountability, formal charges for misconduct, mandatory anti-bias training for the entire department. And I want it all on record. This isn't just about me, it's about ensuring no one else has to go through what I did tonight." Callahan glanced at Lewis, who gave a solemn nod. "It'll be done," she said firmly. "Officer Stevens will face disciplinary action and be removed from duty pending investigation. And I'll personally see to it that the training director Halloway mentioned is implemented across the board." Stevens's head shot up, his face pale. "This is my career you're talking about," he blurted, desperation seeping into his voice. "I made a mistake, but you're going to ruin my life over it." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You held a gun to my back without cause." "That wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. And choices have consequences, Officer Stevens. Maybe this will teach you to think twice the next time you're tempted to let prejudice dictate your actions." The finality in his tone silenced Stevens for good. Callahan stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll have the report finalized and submitted to the appropriate authorities by morning," she said. "Director Halloway, thank you for your cooperation." Marcus rose to his feet, his composure unshaken. "I'll be watching," he said simply, his words carrying both a promise and a warning. The following morning, the incident was the talk of the precinct. Word had spread quickly, not just about Stevens's misconduct, but about who exactly he had targeted, a CA director. The gravity of the situation was undeniable, and the fallout was swift. Officer Stevens sat in a small holding room, his badge and gun already confiscated, waiting for what felt like his execution. His hands trembled as he flipped through the misconduct paperwork he'd been handed earlier. Words like dereliction of duty, racial profiling, and reckless endangerment leapt out at him, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. His face was pale, and the defiance that had carried him through the night before was gone. He knew the evidence was airtight, and there was no way out. Meanwhile, Marcus Halloway was at the CA headquarters, sitting in a sleek office overlooking the sprawling Langley campus. His mind wasn't on his usual high-stakes work involving national security or intelligence briefings. Instead, he was on the phone, ensuring that Stevens's actions wouldn't be quietly buried like so many similar incidents. He spoke calmly but firmly with state officials, ensuring that Stevens would face criminal charges for misuse of force and racial bias. "Governor, this can't just be another case of an officer suspended with pay," Marcus said into the phone. "That's not accountability. If law enforcement wants public trust, they need to show that officers like Stevens don't represent the values they claim to uphold." On the other end of the line, the governor, a middle-aged white man who had long avoided taking strong stances on police misconduct, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Director Halloway, you have my word this matter will be handled appropriately." "We'll make sure the investigation is thorough." "Thorough is good," Marcus replied, his voice like ice, "but decisive is better." When Marcus ended the call, he took a moment to exhale deeply. Despite his calm exterior, the events of the previous night had left a mark. He had faced prejudice many times in his life, even in his climb to the top of the intelligence community, but last night had been different. Being held at gunpoint by someone sworn to protect and serve was a stark reminder of how deeply racism ran in the system. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Sergeant Lewis stood before his officers during a mandatory debriefing. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. "What happened last night was unacceptable," Lewis said, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Stevens didn't just violate protocol, he violated the trust this badge represents, and I'm going to make something clear right now. If any of you think that what he did is defensible, you're in the wrong line of work." The room was silent, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Some officers avoided eye contact, their discomfort evident. Others nodded solemnly, recognizing the need for change. Lewis continued, "Director Halloway's experience should never have happened, and while Stevens will face the consequences of his actions, this department has a responsibility to do better. We're instituting immediate anti-bias training, and I expect every single one of you to treat it as seriously as your firearms training. Lives depend on it." As the day unfolded, Stevens's suspension became public knowledge, and the media caught wind of the story. The headline ran on local news channels by midday: "Officer suspended for holding CA director at gunpoint without cause." Reporters swarmed the precinct, looking for a statement, but the department maintained its silence for the moment. Meanwhile, discussions about racial bias in policing began to dominate the airwaves, with Marcus's name at the center of it all. Back at home that evening, Marcus sat in his quiet living room, sipping a cup of tea as the news anchor recounted the incident. He watched with a measured expression, his mind racing not with anger but with resolve. He knew that Stevens's suspension and pending charges were just the beginning. Real change required more than one officer losing his badge. It required systemic reform, and Marcus was prepared to leverage his position to push for exactly that. Meanwhile, Stevens sat in his apartment, the weight of his actions finally settling in. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, some from colleagues expressing shock, others from friends who weren't sure whether to support him or distance themselves. The news played softly in the background, but Stevens didn't need to hear it. He already knew what they were saying. His career was over, his name tarnished, and there was no one to blame but himself. For the first time in years, Stevens felt something unfamiliar, regret. It wasn't just regret for losing his badge or his standing, it was the growing awareness that he had acted out of sheer prejudice. He thought back to the look in Marcus's eyes the night before, not anger, but disappointment. It stung in a way he couldn't explain. The fallout from the incident continued to ripple outward, sending shockwaves through both the precinct and the community. Marcus Halloway had unintentionally become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change, and while he hadn't sought the spotlight, he knew this moment was too important to ignore. As days passed, conversations surrounding the encounter grew louder. It was no longer just about what had happened to Marcus, it was about what it represented. The issue of racial profiling, long swept under the rug, was now at the forefront of public discourse, and Marcus was determined to ensure it stayed there. 3 days after the incident, Marcus stood at a podium in the state capitol, addressing a crowd that had gathered to hear his response. Cameras clicked furiously, reporters poised to capture every word. Marcus took a deep breath, his commanding presence quieting the murmurs in the room. "Last week, I experienced something that far too many people in this country face every day." He began, his voice steady. "I was judged not by my character or my actions, but by the color of my skin. This wasn't about a broken taillight or a traffic violation. This was about bias, a bias so deeply ingrained that it allows some to see threat where there is none." The room fell silent as Marcus paused, letting his words settle. "I am not here today as a victim," he continued. "I am here as someone who has been given an opportunity to push for change. This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about a system that has allowed incidents like this to happen for decades. That's why I am calling for comprehensive reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for law enforcement, independent oversight committees to ensure transparency, and policies that hold officers accountable for their actions." The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Marcus remained somber, his tone unwavering. "This isn't a moment to celebrate, it's a moment to act. If we want to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, we must confront these issues head-on." While Marcus focused on systemic change, Officer Stevens was beginning to face the consequences of his actions. Suspended from duty and under investigation, Stevens found himself at the center of public scrutiny. News outlets replayed the bodycam footage relentlessly, dissecting his every move, his every word. Stevens's name had become synonymous with racial profiling, and the weight of it was crushing. Sitting in his small apartment, his badge and gun confiscated, Stevens replayed the night's events in his mind. For the first time, he truly saw himself as Marcus had seen him, not as an officer upholding the law, but as a man blinded by prejudice. The investigation moved quickly. The evidence was damning, and within days, Stevens was formally charged with misconduct and reckless endangerment. He sat in a small interrogation room as internal affairs officers laid out the charges. His attempts to defend himself sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly, though he knew it wasn't true. He wasn't just doing his job, he had abused his power, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his efforts behind the scenes. He spoke with state officials, police chiefs, and community leaders, ensuring that the momentum for reform didn't falter. He knew the system wouldn't change overnight, but he also knew that progress started with moments like this, moments where accountability was demanded and action was taken. One evening, Marcus received a call from Sergeant Lewis. The older officer's voice carried a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Director Halloway," Lewis said, "I wanted to let you know we've started implementing the changes you suggested. Anti-bias training is now mandatory, and we've formed an oversight committee with civilian representatives." Marcus leaned back in his chair, allowing a small, satisfied smile to touch his lips. "That's good to hear, Sergeant. It's a step in the right direction. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Marcus's encounter and his subsequent push for reform became a national conversation. Stevens's trial began, and Marcus took the stand as a key witness. He recounted the events of that night with the same calm and clarity that had disarmed Stevens in the first place. The courtroom was silent as he described the moment the gun was pointed at his back, the prejudice he saw in Stevens's eyes, and the resolve he felt not to let it break him. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before finding Stevens guilty of misconduct and reckless endangerment. His sentence was a mix of probation, community service, and mandatory anti-bias training, far from the harsher punishments many had hoped for, but enough to ensure he would never wear a badge again. For Stevens, the verdict was a bitter pill to swallow. His career was over, and his name was tarnished, but as he walked out of the courtroom that day, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing tall on the witness stand, speaking with dignity and strength. It was a moment that would haunt him, but perhaps also one that would teach him. For Marcus, the verdict was just one part of a much larger battle. He knew the road to justice was long, but he also knew that this was a start. The night of the incident had been a moment of injustice, but the days that followed had turned it into something bigger, a catalyst for change. The months that followed the incident were a blur of progress, reflection, and quiet victories. Marcus Halloway found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't intended to lead, but had embraced nonetheless. His voice became a rallying cry for accountability and reform, and his actions served as a reminder that dignity and resilience could dismantle even the most ingrained systems of prejudice. Sitting in his office one evening, Marcus stared out the window at the fading light of the city below. The world outside seemed calm, but he knew that change was often quiet at first. It started in conversations behind closed doors, in training sessions where officers questioned their own biases, and in the policies now being written to ensure a future where people wouldn't have to fear those sworn to protect them. He sipped his tea, reflecting on the night it had all started. The image of Officer Stevens's trembling hands as he aimed his weapon at Marcus's back was seared into his memory, not as a source of anger, but as a symbol of the deep flaws in the system. Stevens's actions weren't an anomaly. They were a product of a culture that had allowed bias to go unchecked for far too long. And yet, Marcus couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The reforms being implemented, the mandatory anti-bias training, the oversight committees, were steps forward. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Marcus thought about Stevens, whose name had become a cautionary tale. Reports had reached Marcus that Stevens, now stripped of his badge, was serving his community service by volunteering at local shelters and attending counseling sessions as part of his sentence. While Marcus had no illusions that Stevens's transformation would be immediate or even complete, he hoped the man would begin to understand the weight of his actions and the damage they had caused. It wasn't forgiveness Marcus sought, but growth from Stevens and from the system as a whole. As Marcus leaned back in his chair, the faint chime of his phone broke the silence. It was Sergeant Lewis. Director Halloway, Lewis began, his voice tinged with respect. I wanted to give you an update. The first round of anti-bias training wrapped up today. We've had officers, some of our best, admit they've never truly reflected on their own biases until now. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. It's more than a start, Sergeant. It's progress. Keep at it. We will, Lewis replied. And sir, I want to thank you. You've set an example not just for us, but for every department watching. I don't think we would have had the courage to make these changes without your push. After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence, the weight of the journey settling over him. He knew there would still be setbacks, moments of frustration, and battles yet to be fought. But he also knew that one night, one encounter, had sparked something that couldn't be extinguished. He thought of the countless people who would never know his name, whose lives might be made a little safer because of the changes being set in motion. That was enough. It had to be. Marcus had spent a lifetime working in the shadows, protecting his country from unseen threats. Now he was shining a light on one of its most visible flaws. As he prepared to leave his office for the night, Marcus paused at the door, looking back at the sleek desk and the reports scattered across it. He had taken on some of the world's most dangerous adversaries, but this fight felt different. It was personal, and it wasn't over. Stepping out into the night, Marcus inhaled the cool air and walked to his car, his mind already turning to the next steps. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. Change, he knew, was a journey, not a destination, and in his own quiet way, Marcus Holloway was determined to keep walking. The end.